Welcome to this video, which is one in our series of informational videos to better explain how the global fertilizer market functions and to consider what drives prices. I am Andrew Prince from F-Curve Agri. In this video, we will look at three broad themes. Firstly, how the global fertilizer industry came into being. Secondly, a high-level introduction into what fertilizer is made from and the scale of the industry. And thirdly, an introduction to the dynamics of the market. What drives the price? Please subscribe to our F-Curve YouTube channel to receive notifications when we publish new videos. There are also other videos that we have published which look more deeply at the specific fertilizer nutrients of nitrogen, phosphates, and potassium, and we invite you to view these. We would also love to hear your feedback or any questions that you may have. Historically, the fertilizer nutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium were supplied by the application of manure in various forms. This was a very low concentration form of nutrients and not really available in the volumes needed to achieve what we know today as optimum nutrient application. As with many technological developments, it was war that really caused a breakthrough. It was the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, where Chilean saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was barred from the Germans. This prompted the Germans to develop the Haber-Bosch process in the 1920s. The Haber-Bosch process is an industrial production of ammonia, fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere with hydrogen from a hydrocarbon feed source. This development brought about the start of chemical or mineral fertilizers as we know them today. At a similar time, there was also the development of sulfuric acid production technology on an industrial scale, which was critical for the production of phosphates. Potash had historically been mined from physical deposits close to the Earth's surface. Again, the development of industrial processes enabled the production of potash from more difficult to access ores. Up until World War II, the expansion of fertilizer production technologies around the world was extremely limited. There were patent restrictions on some of the key aspects of these technologies, which the inventors were reluctant to share. These technologies also had a strong military value, particularly in the case of ammonium nitrate, which was used for explosives and also munitions at that time. The development and understanding of what nutrients were required for large-scale agriculture was also in its infancy. Some of the developed countries had their own research institutes, but this research was generally retained by themselves for the benefit of their own farming sectors and for their own food security, and there was not the widespread sharing of technology that we see today. Liebig's law of the minimum was understood at this point. Just a reminder on what this is, it really says that the fertilizer nutrient that is in shortest supply restrains the effectiveness of fertilization. So if nitrogen is the limiting factor, then an excess of phosphates or potash will not result in any improved yield. It is a balanced nutrient application that is required. Post-World War II, we had a number of politico-economic events. The German technology was distributed among the Allies, and a number of the Allies' former colonies became independent. The memories of wartime shortages, particularly of food, still loomed large, and many of these countries, as they entered independence, had a key focus on food production and food security. The upshot of all of this was that the focus on agriculture and economic upliftment in the 1940s and 1950s saw agriculture booming. We also had the baby boomer generation, a population boom, which meant demand for food grew extremely rapidly. The modern agronomy concept was now widespread, and the usage of fertilizers in commercial farming operations became better understood and commonplace. With issues such as the Cold War and even apartheid sanctions as an example, many countries strove for partial or full self-sufficiency in fertilizer supply, as this was a prerequisite for self-sufficiency or food security. In essence, the only way of ensuring a reliable supply of fertilizers to your farmers was to produce your own. So in this post-war period, we saw how the world population grew very rapidly. In fact, the period between 1950 and 1990 was the fastest growth in the human population that we have ever seen. As mentioned, this growth rate drove food and fertilizer demand, and the world's fertilizer capacity responded. In fact, it grew even faster in percentage terms than the world population. A lot of this excessive fertilizer capacity growth was driven by the focus of countries on their own needs. So we still had this fragmented view of each country producing its own. Bear in mind also that agriculture is seasonal around the world. The Northern Hemisphere, winter and summer is different, obviously, to the Southern Hemisphere. Whereas production of fertilizer, in theory at least, can produce all year round. The fact of the matter is that each country needed enough fertilizer during its planting season, so they either spent 12 months building inventory or built sufficient instantaneous capacity to meet their demand for their planting season. To give some context on the size of the fertilizer industry today, the total nutrient consumption is estimated at around 255 million tons of nutrients. If we consider that the nutrient concentration of product is 40 to 50%, this means that around 500 million tons of fertilizer is used today. This brings us to the next big issue, the raw materials for fertilizer production. In this table, we've got a summary of the world industry around nitrogen, phosphates, and potash. The interesting factors here are really the raw materials, what it's made from. You can see for nitrogen, it's hydrocarbons and air. Phosphates are mined marine deposits typically, and potash comes from mined salt deposits of various types. We can see also that the production base in terms of countries involved differs very widely between the three nutrients. Nitrogen is produced in a number of countries and potash in relatively few countries. As a result, the percentage of production that is traded also varies widely. Given the broader base of urea production, a smaller volume of urea is traded, and at the other extreme, almost 80% of potash is traded. I've also listed who the major importers and exporters are, just to give a little bit of context of trade flows. And there is some information on the project lead times for new projects. What is evident is that fertilizer production requires a supply of various raw materials. However, not all countries have all of these raw materials. Some of the raw materials are also more abundant than others. They also have different end uses, not just fertilizer. So there may be competition from different industries for those raw materials. What emerged during this capacity building period is that countries with a scarcity in certain raw materials had some difficult decisions to make. They either had to source those raw materials, which could be costly, and make that country's food security vulnerable to the supplier cutting off the supply of raw materials. So to solve that problem, we had country-to-country level agreements to agree the supply of raw materials. Or those countries had the choice of sourcing the finished goods, i.e. finished fertilizers. The disadvantage of sourcing raw materials is that domestic fertilizer industry ended up being fairly high cost, or it required government subsidization on those raw materials to prevent excessive food price inflation. Of course, the high costs of raw materials translate into high cost fertilizer, which in turn translates into high cost food production. On the other hand, we had countries with an abundance of raw materials who were able to either export these raw materials or construct fertilizer capacity beyond their own needs and then export the finished fertilizers. The deficits and surpluses of fertilizer production in the 60s and 70s saw some of the first trade barriers coming into being. An example of this is Russian ammonium nitrate being barred from going into the US. The Americans were happy to buy ammonia from the Russians despite the Cold War, but they drew the line at buying finished ammonium nitrate, which was cheaper being produced in Russia and put the American domestic fertilizer production assets under cost pressure. We've seen how fertilizers became a global commodity. It makes sense to dive a little deeper into what a commodity really is. The dictionary definition of a commodity is a substance or good that can be bought, traded, or sold, and it has an intrinsic value, which means it's actually got a purpose. It's not just a concept. First, it is a good that is usually produced and or sold by many different companies or manufacturers. Second, it is uniform in quality between companies that produce and sell it. One cannot tell the difference between one firm's goods and another. Again, these definitions fit fertilizer like a glove. The important reason for flagging all of this is that the price of a commodity is determined by the interaction of supply and demand in a market. So where the product is in excess or in shortage, the price moves commensurately. As countries with abundant raw materials or a surplus of finished fertilizers started to sell these products to other countries, a surplus of fertilizers was created globally. This surplus pushed fertilizer prices down and started to pressure the countries with high-cost domestic production. And it made more sense for those countries to consider importing rather than producing their own fertilizer. This, of course, had to be weighed against the issue of food security or fertilizer security, against the economic advantage of cheaper imported product. During the 80s and 90s, there were a number of trade agreements between countries and regions, such as the European Union coming into effect, the North American Free Trade Agreement, as well as the fall of the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War. And of course, in the case of South Africa, we had the end of apartheid, resulting in the dropping of sanctions. All of this resulted in a period of rapid globalization, with commodities becoming more freely traded and new equilibrium prices being established. In practice, this meant that fertilizer was more readily available around the world, and the price started to reflect the balance between supply and demand. We then had the industrial development of the gas-rich Middle East and a lot of fertilizer capacity development there. We also had the economic boom in China driving fertilizer capacity in the East Asian region. This all resulted in high-cost fertilizer plants around the world beginning to be closed. The European Union led in this respect, as its common economy meant that each member state no longer needed to have its own fertilizer production capacity or to worry about food security, as there was the broader alliance between countries. In any case, most of those European Union fertilizer plants were parastatals. Government support was already in place to keep these plants functioning, as they were high cost. Under the formation of the EU, these factories were privatized or closed. An example of all of this was the formation of Yara, which was formerly Norsk Hydro, a Norwegian parastatal. They listed the company, and that entity then bought and either restructured or closed European capacity. Another example is the fall of the Soviet Union and the independence of its member countries, resulting in many fertilizer plants in that former Soviet region becoming defunct, whether due to age or the removal of the raw material supply from Russia, or just becoming technologically obsolete. So we've seen how fertilizer went from a strategic product at a country level to a global commodity. In summary for this video, we have conveyed how fertilizers emerged on an industrial level around 100 years ago, and during the 20th century went from being national assets of individual countries to becoming global commodities. It is important to remember that commodities flow or are traded from locations with a surplus to locations with a deficit. The force that drives this trade flow is price. The producer with surplus product is likely to keep selling while the price is above his own production cost. Similarly, should fertilizer prices rise above the point where the buyer can afford to continue using fertilizer, then demand starts to shrink. So if we measure events in the fertilizer sector as being either supply or demand events, we can begin to consider what impact these events might have on fertilizer availability and therefore price. It's not always so easy to see or to evaluate, but hopefully you've learned a few factors that you can look out for in understanding where fertilizer prices might move next. That concludes this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned a few new facts around a very old industry. A final reminder just to look at our other videos in this series where we look at the specific fertilizer nutrients, if you haven't done so already. There is also a video introducing our company, F-Curve Agri, and our contact details. Thanks for your interest, and we look forward to hearing from you.